The moment the audio started playing through the speakers, the entire room froze as if someone had cut the power to human movement itself, and Daniel Mercer felt the blood drain from his face before he even recognized his own voice echoing back at him, distorted slightly by cheap compression, but unmistakably his, saying words he didn't remember choosing, words that sounded colder, sharper, more calculating than anything he would have admitted to out loud. And yet, there they were, filling the city council chamber, where reporters had been yawning 5 minutes earlier, and now leaned forward like predators, sensing exposed flesh, because the recording wasn't just about a private conversation. It was about land, money, leverage, and a deal that would decide who owned half of Westbrook County's undeveloped riverfront. And Daniel's wife Claire stood across the room with her arms folded, her expression unreadable, while Councilman Reeves slammed his palm against the table and demanded to know who authorized the playback. But no one answered, because the truth had already begun spreading faster than any explanation could catch it, and Daniel's mind raced backward, trying to reconstruct the last 48 hours, the last week, the last conversation, where he might have slipped, where he might have trusted the wrong person, where someone might have been recording him while he leaned too close, lowered his voice, and spoke like a man who believed he was untouchable. And then he saw her, not Claire, not the council members, but Lila Grant standing near the back, her posture relaxed, her eyes locked on him with a calm that didn't belong in a room like this. And that was when he understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the ground tilt under him, that this wasn't a leak. It was a move, a deliberate strike in a game he thought he was controlling. And the audio continued, revealing just enough to suggest coercion without proving it outright, a careful line drawn between implication and accusation. And Daniel felt a surge of anger rise through the shock, because whoever had done this knew exactly how to hurt him without handing him a clean way to fight back. And Claire finally moved, stepping forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and she didn't look at him when she spoke, her voice steady but tight, as she asked, "Is that you, Daniel?" And the question landed harder than any accusation, because it demanded not just denial but credibility, something he could feel slipping out of his grasp with every second that recording played. And he opened his mouth, closed it, then forced himself to speak, saying it was edited, manipulated, taken out of context, the usual defenses that sounded hollow even to his own ears. And the room responded not with outrage but with a kind of quiet recalculation, people adjusting their mental maps of power and risk, deciding where to stand now that the narrative had shifted. And in the back, Leela tilted her head slightly, almost curious, as if observing a controlled experiment, rather than a man's public unraveling. And Daniel realized with a cold clarity that this wasn't about the council vote anymore. It was about leverage on a scale he hadn't anticipated. Because whoever controlled that recording controlled the next move, and as the audio cut off abruptly, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt heavier than the noise, Councilman Reeves demanded a recess. Reporters surged forward, and Claire finally turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his face, not for truth, but for consistency, for something she could align with. And he saw doubt there, real doubt. And that terrified him more than the scandal itself, because Claire had always been his anchor, his strategist, the one who understood the game as well as he did, and if she was starting to question him, then the foundation beneath everything they had built together was already cracking. And as security tried to restore order, Daniel pushed through the crowd, ignoring shouted questions, ignoring the flashes of cameras, and stepped into the hallway where the noise dimmed just enough for him to think. And he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving automatically to call Marcus Hale, his longtime attorney and fixer, but before he could hit dial, a message popped up from an unknown number. That was just the first clip, and Daniel stared at the screen, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest, because first meant there were more, and more meant escalation, and escalation meant whoever was behind this intended to dismantle him piece by piece. And he typed back, "What do you want?" But the message sat unsent for a moment as he hesitated, because sending it meant acknowledging the game on their terms, and yet not sending it meant staying blind. And he pressed send anyway, watching the little indicator spin. And then another message came through almost immediately. "Meet me, tonight, alone." And an address followed, a downtown hotel he recognized as neutral ground for deals that weren't meant to be documented. And Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, trying to shift from reaction to strategy. Because panic would only make him predictable, and predictable meant vulnerable. And as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he became aware of footsteps approaching. And when he turned, Claire was there, her expression no longer searching but sharpened into something more dangerous assessment. And she didn't waste time with preamble. She said, "If there's more of that recording, I need to know what's on it before anyone else hears it." and Daniel met her gaze, knowing this was a pivot point, that whatever he said next would either rebuild a fragile alliance or fracture it completely. And he chose partial truth, saying, "It's a negotiation. I was pushing hard, that's all." And Claire studied him, her silence stretching just long enough to make him uncomfortable, before she said, "That didn't sound like negotiation. It sounded like pressure," and Daniel felt irritation flare, not because she was wrong, but because she was saying it out loud. And he replied, "That's how these deals work. You know that." And she nodded slowly. But there was a distance in her eyes now, a recalibration of trust that he couldn't undo with words alone. And she said, "Then you'd better figure out who recorded you and why, before they decide to release the rest." And she turned away, already pulling out her own phone, already moving into damage control mode, and Daniel watched her go, feeling the first real crack in their partnership widen. And he knew he couldn't afford to lose her, not now, not when everything else was shifting, but he also knew he couldn't tell her everything. Not yet, because some of what was on those recordings would implicate not just him, but decisions they had both quietly supported. Lines they had both agreed to blur for the sake of winning. And as the hallway emptied, and the noise from the chamber resumed behind closed doors, Daniel forced himself to focus on the immediate problem. The meeting, the unknown number, the person pulling the strings, and his mind kept circling back to Lila Grant, her calm, her timing, the way she had positioned herself just within his line of sight as the audio played. And he remembered their last conversation weeks ago, a tense exchange about the riverfront bid, where she had accused him of leveraging insider relationships, and he had dismissed her concerns with a polite smile and a reminder that she was new to the game, that she didn't yet understand how things worked in Westbrook, and now he wondered if that had been the moment she decided to prove him wrong. And the idea that he had underestimated her made his jaw tighten, because underestimation was a mistake he prided himself on avoiding, and yet here he was, reacting instead of controlling. And as he stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the city looked the same, cars moving, people crossing streets, the ordinary rhythm of a place that didn't yet realize its power structure was being quietly rearranged. But Daniel could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building before a storm, and he knew the meeting tonight would either give him a chance to regain control or confirm that he was already several moves behind. And he couldn't shake the message's phrasing, the casual certainty of it, the implication that whoever sent it expected him to come, expected him to comply, and that expectation irritated him, because it suggested they believed they had leverage strong enough to dictate his actions. And maybe they did, at least for now, but Daniel Mercer had built his reputation on turning disadvantage into opportunity, on finding the angle others missed. And as he walked toward his car, he began to reconstruct the possible scenarios, mapping out who had access, who had motive, who had the technical capability to capture that conversation without his knowledge, and each possibility led back to a small circle of individuals, all of whom had something to gain from weakening him, but only one of whom had the composure to execute something this precise without overplaying their hand. And Lila's face kept surfacing in his mind, not as a confirmed answer, but as a persistent question. And he decided he would treat her as the primary suspect until proven otherwise, which meant he needed to learn more about her, her connections, her vulnerabilities, before the meeting, before the next clip surfaced, because information was the only currency that mattered in a situation like this. And as he unlocked his car and slid into the driver's seat, he allowed himself one brief moment of honesty, admitting internally that he had made a mistake, not necessarily in what he had said on that recording, but in assuming it would never be used against him. And that assumption had created an opening, and someone had exploited it, and now the game had changed, and he would have to adapt faster than they expected, because if he didn't, he wouldn't just lose the deal, he would lose everything tied to it, his influence, his reputation, his standing in a network that tolerated aggressive tactics only as long as they remained invisible. And as the engine started and he pulled into traffic, Daniel's phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number, just 2 words this time. "Don't be late," and he smiled faintly despite himself, a reaction born not of amusement, but of recognition, because this was no longer a quiet negotiation behind closed doors. This was a confrontation disguised as one, and he had been invited not as the host but as the target, and somewhere in the city, the person orchestrating this was already anticipating his moves, already planning their next step. And Daniel intended to make sure that when they finally sat across from each other, the balance of power would not be as one-sided as they believed, even if he had to tear apart half the alliances he had spent years building to make that happen. And as he drove, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the road, he prepared himself for the night ahead, knowing that whatever waited for him at that hotel would not just reveal the identity of his opponent, but force him to confront the full extent of what he had set in motion long before the recording ever played, and what it might cost him to stop it now. He parked 2 blocks from the hotel instead of using the valet, partly out of habit and partly because he wanted the walk, wanted the minute and a half of city noise to flatten his pulse into something usable, and as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the air felt colder than it had an hour earlier, carrying the smell of wet concrete, old fryer grease from the bar on the corner, and exhaust drifting low between buildings whose windows reflected the last bruised strip of evening. And Daniel adjusted his coat, not because he was cold, but because his hands needed something controlled to do, some small ritual to keep from betraying the fact that his nerves were running faster than his face was willing to admit. And by the time he reached the hotel entrance, he had already reviewed 3 possible openings, 2 lies, and 1 contingency involving Marcus, whom he still had not called because the meeting demanded uncertainty. And uncertainty was easier to navigate alone than with another witness attached to it. The lobby was all polished marble, amber lamps, and the soft, expensive quiet of a place where people came to make arrangements they did not want remembered. And Daniel's eyes moved automatically across the room, taking in the couple near the bar, pretending not to argue, the man in a navy suit checking his watch too often, the front desk clerk with the blank professionalism of someone trained never to notice patterns. And then the elevator doors opened, and Lila Grant stepped out as if she had been timed to the second, wearing a dark coat over a cream blouse, nothing theatrical, nothing designed to shock. And that ordinary restraint irritated him more than open smugness would have, because it meant she intended to act like this was business, not revenge, and Daniel stood still for half a beat before walking toward her, his shoes almost silent on the stone. And when they stopped an arm's length apart, she gave him the smallest nod and said, "You came alone." And he answered, "You asked for it." And she held his gaze long enough for him to understand she was measuring whether he meant obedience or strategy, then turned toward the lounge off the lobby and said, "Good," and he followed. The room they entered was dim without being dark, designed to flatter faces and hide expression. Low brass lights, leather chairs, shelves of decorative books nobody read, and a pianist in the far corner, turning familiar songs into something elegant enough to disappear into the walls. And Lila chose a table with a view of both exits, which Daniel noticed immediately. And the fact that she knew to choose it confirmed something he had been resisting all afternoon, that she was not improvising, not operating on anger or luck, but on preparation. And when they sat, she placed her phone on the table face down between them like a marker, not threatening, not casual, simply present. And Daniel looked at it, then, at her, and said, "You want money?" And Lila almost smiled, not with amusement, but with disbelief. And she leaned back, folded one leg over the other, and said, "That's the first thing you can imagine, because it's the first thing you would ask for." And the words landed with a clean edge, and Daniel felt the impulse to push back, to remind her who had more to lose and who had more reach. But he held himself still, let his fingers rest lightly on the arm of the chair, and said, "Then tell me what this is." And for the first time, a flicker crossed her face. Not hesitation exactly, but the discomfort of deciding how much truth to spend at once. And she said, "It's the end of you making people choose between their silence and their livelihood." And Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose, a sound just short of a laugh, because righteous language always irritated him when it came wrapped around tactical cruelty. And he said, "That recording doesn't prove what you think it proves." And she answered, "It proves enough." And before he could respond, she reached into her bag, removed a slim envelope, and slid it across the table with 2 fingers, and Daniel looked at it for a moment before picking it up, feeling the thickness of paper, the stiff corners of photographs maybe, and when he opened it, he found copies, not originals, of bank transfers, shell company registration documents, and 1 page from a trust amendment bearing his father's signature. And the instant he saw that last sheet, something inside him tightened hard, because the land deal was one thing, ugly but survivable, while family trust documents belonged to another battlefield entirely, one with older wounds and less predictable loyalties. And Daniel kept his expression as neutral as he could, while scanning the page again, recognizing the amendment language, the shift in beneficiary structure, the clause that would reroute controlling interest in Mercer development if certain conditions were triggered. And he raised his eyes slowly to Lila and asked, "Where did you get this?" And she did not answer at first, only rested her forearms on the table and watched him absorb the implications. And when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier steel and settled into something lower, steadier, more dangerous because it sounded personal. And she said, "Your father didn't trust you nearly as much as you thought he did." And Daniel felt heat climb the back of his neck, not from embarrassment, but from the old, humiliating pressure of being judged by a dead man whose approval had always been conditional and strategic and never once warm. And for a second, the lounge blurred around the edges as memory surfaced too fast to stop his father in the study at 17, tapping a silver letter opener against a stack of contracts and telling him that loyalty was useful only when it was enforced. His father at 34, refusing to hand over final control of the company. While Daniel did most of the work and took most of the blame, his father, 6 months before his death, already diminished but still sharp enough to ask whether Claire was loyal to Daniel or merely loyal to the future. Mercer's name promised her, and Daniel shoved the memory down, because Lila was watching for weakness, and he would not give her one. "You're involving yourself in things you don't understand," he said. But the sentence came out flatter than he intended, and Lila caught it. Of course she caught it, and she tilted her head just slightly. "No," she said. "I understand exactly enough. Your father altered the trust. You found out after he died. You've been trying to keep the board, your wife, and your brother from seeing how fragile your control actually is. The Riverfront project wasn't expansion. It was cover. You need liquidity and political protection at the same time, and when people didn't cooperate, you pushed." Daniel said nothing, because denying too much too quickly would reveal more than silence. And in the pause, a server approached, asking whether they wanted drinks, and Lila ordered bourbon neat without consulting him, while Daniel asked for black coffee, and after the server left, he realized she had done that deliberately too. Set the table with contrast, made him look like the man trying to stay sharp, while she looked like the one already comfortable in chaos. "What do you want?" he asked again, and this time the question came out quieter, cleaner, not because he was weaker, but because the room between them had changed, and Lila answered without flourish. "I want you out of the council vote. I want you to withdraw Mercer Development's Riverfront bid. I want the pressure campaign against the Hollis family and the old neighborhood association to stop tonight. I want copies of every agreement you made with Reeves and the zoning committee. And I want you to tell your wife the truth before someone else does." Daniel stared at her, then let his tongue press briefly against the inside of his cheek. A tiny gesture Claire had once told him meant he was deciding how cruel to be, and when he spoke there was a trace of that cruelty back in his voice. "You're overestimating your leverage. Even if you drop more audio, it becomes a media cycle. Ugly, yes. Fatal, no. These documents raise questions, but they don't convict anyone. And if you think I'm going to dismantle my own position because you assembled a dramatic folder, then you've confused exposure with power." Lila listened without interrupting, which unnerved him more than outrage would have. And when he finished, she nodded once, almost respectfully, then picked up her phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward him. It was not audio this time. It was a video, grainy from a distance, but clear enough, showing Daniel's brother Ethan stepping out of a parking garage 2 months earlier with a woman who was not his wife, their movements too close, too practiced, followed by a second clip of the same woman entering a condo. Daniel recognized instantly because Mercer Development owned the building through a quiet holding company, and before Daniel could fully process why Leela was showing him that, she swiped again to an image of Claire seated at lunch with Councilman Reeves, leaning forward over a file Daniel had never seen. And then another, older, more brutal in its simplicity. Daniel's father on the back patio of the family home, speaking to Claire in hushed intensity only weeks before his death. "You should be asking," Leela said, her voice almost gentle now. "Who has been building leverage on whom for the last year, because it isn't just me." Daniel's throat tightened. Not visibly, he hoped, but enough that swallowing required effort, and the room's carefully controlled warmth suddenly felt stale, overused, and he forced himself to keep looking at the screen, though every instinct told him to look away, to refuse the images any authority. Yet each one nested inside an existing insecurity, so precisely that denial became harder than anger. And the most dangerous part was not the possibility that the images misled, but the possibility that they did not, that he had been moving through his own life, assuming he was the central strategist, while parallel games had unfolded around him, some of them inside his own marriage, inside his own family. And he heard himself ask, "Who gave you these?" And Lila locked the phone and placed it back on the table. "Someone who was tired of being used by all of you." "Who?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "Of course it does," she said. And there it was again. That refusal to perform for him, that infuriating calm. "But you're still thinking like this is about identifying one disloyal person and punishing them until everything returns to normal. There is no normal left." The drinks arrived, and for several seconds neither of them touched them. Daniel wrapped his hand around the coffee cup just for the heat, feeling it against his palm, while his mind raced across names, assistants, drivers, Junior associates, Ethan's carelessness, Claire's silences, Reeves's appetite, his father's paranoia calcified into paperwork that still reached past death, and the scale of it made him feel, for one dangerous instant, genuinely tired, not physically but structurally, as though the architecture of his life had been built out of mutually reinforcing threats, and he was only now noticing that every beam was cracked. He took a sip of coffee, bitter and too hot, and said, "Suppose I believe you. Suppose I step back from the vote. You think that ends this?" "No," Lila said. "I think it begins consequences. For me. For everyone." Daniel looked at her more carefully then, past the confidence, past the meticulous timing, and saw something else he had missed before, something like exhaustion disciplined into purpose, and he realized she had not done all this merely to wound him, or even to win a policy fight. She needed something broken that had once looked immovable. She needed a structure to fail in public. "Who did we hurt?" he asked, and the "we" was intentional, bait and probe at once, but it worked in a different way than he expected, because Lila's face hardened with an emotion she had so far kept hidden. "You don't even remember them in singular form," she said. "It's always units, holds, parcels, families relocating, temporary pressure points. The Hollises owned that auto shop for 41 years. Reeves threatened code enforcement. Your office offered them half value. When they refused, someone leaked the son's sealed juvenile record to a local blog. 3 days later, the bank reopened a review on their line of credit." Daniel set down the cup very carefully. He had not ordered the juvenile record leak. He knew that at once, knew it with the clarity of a man recognizing not innocence but a boundary he had not personally crossed. And yet, the distinction gave him no relief, because it meant someone in his orbit had escalated beyond his instructions while assuming they were serving his objectives. And in some ways that was worse. "I didn't authorize that," he said. Lila held his gaze. "Do you hear yourself? That's your defense? That your machine committed one cruelty without the owner signing the line item?" He wanted to answer, wanted to push back with process, deniability, plausible distance, but all of it sounded morally thin even before he shaped the words, and instead, he found himself thinking of Claire again, of the first years when they had still believed ambition was a form of cleanliness, when they dressed long hours and ruthless choices in the language of stability, of legacy, of building something lasting, and he wondered at what exact point they had stopped noticing the translation between necessity and appetite. Leela lifted her glass, took a measured sip, and said, "I know you didn't come here to confess. So here's the practical version. By tomorrow morning, if you haven't withdrawn, the second audio file goes public. By noon, the trust amendment reaches the board. By evening, your brother's wife gets the video. After that, I stop sequencing. Everything goes where it goes." Daniel sat back slowly, the leather creaking under his shoulders, and looked past her toward the piano, where the player's hands moved with effortless discipline across the keys, each note controlled, anticipated, and for a strange second, the steadiness of that movement made the rest of the room feel unreal, like a set built around a collapse already decided off stage. And when he returned his attention to Lila, he saw no triumph in her expression, only resolve, and that absence frightened him more than hatred would have, because hatred could be redirected, exploited, exhausted, while resolve simply continued. "You know this won't spare you," he said. "Reeves will bury you if he survives. The board will deny everything. The press will use you and move on. And if you think the people behind me don't know how to retaliate, you're not as prepared as you think." Lila nodded once. "I know. Then why do it?" "Because nobody ever stops, unless stopping costs them more than continuing." The sentence settled between them, and Daniel understood with a reluctant, almost painful clarity that she was right. Not in every detail, not in every assumption, but in that one fundamental principle. Cost was the only language his world had consistently respected. He checked his watch out of reflex, then hated himself for the gesture because it suggested impatience when what he felt was compression, time narrowing around a decision that would not remain containable much longer, and he thought of Claire again, of whether she was at home or still in her office, whether she had already begun calling donors, allies, reporters she could soften, whether she knew about Reeves, whether the photograph was innocent, whether innocence even mattered once an image existed in the right hands. And the thought of bringing her the truth, whatever version of truth remained possible, felt less like confession than detonation. He looked at the envelope, at the phone, at Lila's unwavering face, and then he made the only move available to a man who realized he had fewer choices than he had believed. "I'll withdraw from tomorrow's hearing," he said. Lila did not move. "Tonight," she replied. "You send the letter tonight." He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave one small nod, each inch of motion expensive. And the rest? You bring me the agreements by morning. That's not enough time. It is if you know where they are. Daniel almost said, I do, then stopped himself because the admission would have been gratuitous. And instead, he rose from the chair, slipped the documents back into the envelope, and picked up his coat. Lila stayed seated. Daniel, she said. And when he looked at her, she added, tell Claire before someone else does. That's the only mercy still on the table. He wanted to ask whether she believed in mercy, wanted to tell her she had mistaken destruction for reform, wanted to remind her that once structures broke, innocent people got crushed under falling pieces too. But all of those thoughts felt less like arguments than attempts to preserve a version of himself that no longer fit the evidence. So he said nothing, turned, and walked out of the lounge into the brighter lobby, where the ordinary sounds of glassware, footsteps, and low conversation resumed their indifferent rhythm around him. And as he crossed the marble floor, he felt the weight of the envelope under his arm like a second pulse. Steady and damning, while somewhere above him in one of the hotel rooms, behind one of the sealed doors, people were likely making their own arrangements, telling their own partial truths, buying their own extra days before exposure, and when the night air hit his face outside, it felt sharper now, almost clean, and Daniel stood on the sidewalk for a moment without moving, staring at the traffic light changing at the intersection ahead, green to yellow to red, and he knew with a certainty that hollowed him out that whatever he chose next, by this time tomorrow, one part of his life would be saved only by sacrificing another, and the knowledge did not clarify him so much as strip him down to a harder, lonelier version of himself, the one his father had spent years trying to engineer, the one Claire had married because she thought she could guide it, the one Ethan had spent most of his life resenting. And at last, Daniel reached for his phone, scrolled past Marcus, past Reeves, past 3 numbers that would have helped him hide, and stopped on Claire's name with his thumb hovering there in the cold. Knowing the call would not repair anything, knowing it might in fact begin the fracture that could never be mended, and then he pressed it anyway, lifting the phone to his ear as headlights slid across the street, and the line began to ring. Claire answered on the 4th ring, and by then Daniel had already imagined 3 versions of her voice, the brittle one she used in public emergencies, the low dangerous one reserved for private betrayal, and the flat, exhausted one that meant she had already moved past anger into calculation. But what came through the phone was something stranger, a controlled quiet that sounded as if she had stepped out of a room full of people and shut a door behind her before speaking, and she said, "Where are you?" without greeting, without accusation, and Daniel turned away from the street on instinct, one hand in his coat pocket, eyes fixed on the black glass of the hotel windows, as if they might reflect the right answer back to him, and he said, "Downtown," then added, because anything less would waste the only advantage left to him, "I just met with the person behind the recording," and there was a pause on her end, not long, but long enough for him to hear the faint clink of ice in a glass, and the muted wash of voices somewhere near her, and then she asked, "Who?" And Daniel said, "Lila Grant," and Claire exhaled once, a small sound that could have meant surprise or confirmation, and that ambiguity tightened something in him, because for years he had relied on being the one who noticed the second layer first, the one who could hear the truth inside what people chose not to say, and now he was listening to his own wife and hearing too many possible meanings at once. "Did you know?" he asked, and he hated the question even as he said it, hated the fact that it made him sound like a husband instead of an operator, like a man asking for reassurance when reassurance had already become a luxury item, and Claire did not answer immediately. "Know what?" she said at last, and the precision of it irritated him, that she had recordings, that she had documents, that she was building a case against the riverfront deal. "No," Claire said, and then, after a beat, "But I knew something was moving." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, feeling the cold air against his face, the pressure of traffic passing behind him, and asked, "How?" Claire said, "Because Reeves has been acting like a man who knows he won't be left holding the full weight when the ceiling comes down." And Daniel opened his eyes and looked at the hotel entrance again, the revolving door turning lazily as a couple emerged, laughing, untouched by anything that mattered to him. And he said, "She has trust documents," and that changed the silence at once. It sharpened. Claire's voice dropped. "What documents?" "An amendment. My father's." Another pause, tighter now. "How much did she show you?" "Enough." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting until I know what you knew." The words came out harder than he intended, but once spoken they felt necessary, and on the other end, he heard Claire move, perhaps setting down the drink, perhaps standing up, and when she spoke again the quiet was gone, replaced by the clear-edged authority she used when the truth was already ugly, and there was no point softening it. I knew there was a Second Amendment, she said. I did not know she had it. Daniel stood completely still. The city noise seemed to recede, not because it had quieted, but because something inside him had gone abruptly inward, contracting around a single fact so sharp it made the rest of the night briefly unreal. Since when? He asked. Since 3 months after your father died. He laughed once, without humor. 3 months. Daniel. 3 months. You were in litigation with Ethan over the board seat. You were trying to close the Ashbury acquisition. And every day you woke up looking for a target. There was never a good time. That's not your choice to make. No, she said. And now he could hear anger under her control. But it became mine the day I realized you would treat it like a provocation instead of information. Daniel pressed his fingers against his forehead, then let his hand fall. On the glass across the street, headlights slid and vanished. What did it say? He asked. You know what it said if she showed you the page. I want to hear you say it. Claire was quiet for a moment, and when she finally spoke, the words came carefully, as if each one had been weighed before release. It shifted provisional voting control if you entered a debt position that put the company at strategic risk. It created a review mechanism. Ethan wasn't named as sole successor, but he was named as co-trigger. Daniel felt his jaw lock. The Riverfront project, then, had not merely been aggressive expansion. It had been dangerous in a way his father had anticipated, or feared, or perhaps hoped to restrain from beyond the grave. A review mechanism, a trap disguised as governance. He could see the phrasing on the page in his mind, the neat formal language masking what was, in practical terms, an insult. You may lead, but only until we decide you cannot. And you kept that from me, he said. I delayed telling you, Claire corrected. That is not the same thing. It is if the effect is identical. The effect, Claire said. And now the anger surfaced fully. Might have been worse if I told you sooner. You were already acting like every problem required force. If I'd shown you that amendment in the middle of the Ethan fight, you would have gone to war with your brother publicly, challenged the estate, burned half the board, and made yourself look exactly like the man your father was afraid you were becoming. Daniel nearly answered with reflexive contempt. Nearly told her his father's fear had always been a management tool, one more way of withholding approval to keep everyone hungry, but the sentence stalled because buried inside her accusation was an unpleasant possibility that he could not dismiss outright. He had, in that period, become impossible, restless, suspicious, furious at delay, convinced that softness was just a prelude to dispossession. He had demanded loyalty so often that the word itself had started to sound like a threat. Who else knew? He asked. The attorney who drafted it. Me, your father's accountant, briefly, and eventually Reeves, because he saw enough in the debt structure to guess there was a protective clause somewhere, and I made the mistake of trying to manage him instead of cutting him loose. Daniel turned that over, each piece sliding into place with the quiet horror of a lock engaging. So that's why you met with him? Yes. At lunch? Yes. Without telling me, because at the time I was trying to keep him from sniffing around the board, Claire snapped, then lowered her voice again. And because every conversation with you had become either a test or a performance. I was tired, Daniel. The honesty of that hit differently than accusation. Tired. Not betrayed, not shocked, not morally outraged. Tired. As if living beside him had become a long administrative burden punctuated by damage control. He leaned one shoulder against the cold stone facade of the hotel and stared down the block, where a man in a knit cap was dragging metal chairs inside a closed cafe, each scrape against concrete, bright and unpleasant in the night. Lila says I need to withdraw tonight, he said. From tomorrow's hearing? From the whole vote? And are you going to? He let the question hang. Across the street, a traffic signal changed again, red bleeding into green. If I don't, he said. She releases another clip in the morning, sends the trust amendment to the board by noon, and delivers Ethan's affair to his wife by evening. For the first time, Claire made a sound that was not controlled. It was small, sharp, almost like she had bitten the inside of her cheek. She has proof? Video. Jesus. Daniel said nothing. He could picture Ethan's face too clearly. The performative charm, the carelessness mistaken for ease, the way he moved through consequences assuming someone else would absorb the first impact. He had spent half his life envying Daniel's authority, and the other half sabotaging his own claim to it. Where are you going now? Claire asked. Home. No. The response was immediate. Not yet. He straightened. What? Come to the office. It's 10 at night. I know what time it is. Why? Because if you walk into that house carrying this much anger and half these assumptions, we'll spend the next 3 hours burning down whatever remains, and still have nothing in writing before morning. Daniel almost refused on instinct. Home meant territory, walls, familiar objects, the ability to use silence as a weapon. The office meant fluorescent truth, files, evidence, language pinned to paper. It meant Claire on ground, where she was often better than he was, which was probably why she wanted him there. "You think I'm the only one carrying assumptions?" he asked. "No," she said, and there was weariness again now, stripped of performance. "I think we're both out of room for them." He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the envelope under his arm, feeling the paper inside shift. "I met with Lila alone," he said. "Was that supposed to scare me?" "No. She told me to tell you the truth before someone else did." Then for once, she's not wrong. The sentence stung more than he expected. Daniel pushed away from the wall and began walking toward the corner, not because he had decided anything, but because standing still made him feel exposed. "Are you alone?" he asked. "No. I'm with Karen and 2 associates from litigation." "Get rid of them." "I already did. They're downstairs waiting to be called back." He almost smiled at that, not from affection but from recognition. Claire always moved 2 steps ahead of the announcement. She had likely cleared the office the moment she saw the second wave coming. "Fine," he said. 20 minutes. Drive carefully." He nearly responded with something bitter, but careful had become meaningless, but she had already disconnected, and Daniel lowered the phone slowly, staring at the dark screen until his own reflection resolved there, in fragments, forehead, mouth, one tired eye cut by streetlight. He slid the phone into his pocket and stood for another moment before heading toward his car, and with each step the conversation replayed in sharper pieces. Not the facts alone, but the tones between them, the places where Claire had not defended herself, the places where she had, the places where truth had entered, not as relief, but as acceleration. She knew about the amendment. She had met with Reeves. She had decided what he could bear to know, and when. None of that fit cleanly into betrayal or protection. It was something messier, more corrosive, because it had likely begun as one and drifted into the other. By the time he reached the car, he was less angry than altered, as though some internal alignment had shifted a few degrees and made all the old landmarks unreliable. He got in, set the envelope on the passenger seat, and sat without starting the engine, looking at it. The cream paper looked harmless in the dark interior, just another folder among 1,000 from the past decade, and yet it seemed to radiate consequence. He thought of his father's handwriting on legal pads, blunt and slanted, always pressing hard enough to leave impressions on the next page. He thought of being 12 and waiting outside the study because he had broken a window with a baseball and knew judgment was coming, not because of the damage, but because of what the damage revealed about carelessness. He thought of being 28 and presenting his first independent deal, only to watch his father skim the final page and ask who had protected him from the downside. Protected him. The phrase had always carried contempt in that house. Protection was for weak men, until the moment powerful men wanted it built discreetly around themselves. Maybe that was what the amendment had really been. Not distrust, but projection. A dead man safeguarding the empire against the parts of himself he recognized too clearly in his son. Daniel started the engine at last and pulled into traffic, and the drive to the office felt both too short and unnaturally suspended. Every red light an invitation to think, and every green one a denial of delay. Downtown thinned as he crossed into the business district, where office towers stood in ordered rows, most windows dark, a few still lit with the lonely endurance of people being paid to postpone failure until morning. He parked in the underground garage, took the envelope, and rode the elevator up alone. The mirrored walls showed him 4 versions of himself from different angles: the composed face, the tight shoulders, the hand flexing once at his side, the mouth set not in confidence but restraint. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the corridor lights were on, but dimmed to after-hours levels, softening the chrome and glass into something almost intimate, and the quiet there was distinct from the hotel's curated hush. This quiet belonged to institutions after midnight, to printers asleep, to conference rooms holding the residue of arguments no one had won. Claire's office door stood open. He could see the edge of her desk lamp from the hall, a warm pool of light against the larger dark. He walked toward it slowly, hearing the muffled sound of papers being moved, a drawer closing, the soft, decisive efficiency that had once made him admire her before he learned it could also shut him out. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. Claire was standing behind her desk in shirt sleeves, jacket off, blouse loosened at the collar, one hand flat on a spread of documents, the other holding her reading glasses by one temple. She looked up at him, and for a second neither spoke. There was no dramatic shock left between them now, only recognition. 2 people seeing the wreckage more clearly because some of the dust had settled. The city glowed faintly behind her through the windows. On the desk sat a laptop, a legal pad, 3 marked folders, and a glass of water untouched beside her phone. She looked tired, older than she had that morning, but not weakened. If anything, she looked distilled. Daniel stepped inside, closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and placed Leela's envelope on the desk without sitting down. Claire's eyes dropped to it, then rose back to his face. And in that measured silence, he understood that whatever came next would not be a marital argument in any ordinary sense. It would be an accounting, not only of documents and schemes, but of years of omissions that had been called strategy, and loyalties that had been rented out to ambition, until neither of them could say exactly where the transaction had begun. And Daniel pulled out the chair opposite her desk, but did not lower himself into it yet, because standing still gave him one last thin illusion of control before the night's real conversation began. He stayed standing long enough for the silence to become a tactic of its own, and Claire, who knew him well enough to see the calculation in even the angle of his shoulders, set the glasses down beside the legal pad and said, "Sit down, Daniel." Not sharply, not softly either, but with the blunt practicality of someone who no longer had patience for posture masquerading as strength, and he looked at the chair, then at her, then finally lowered himself into it with controlled reluctance, smoothing one hand once over the front of his coat before unbuttoning it, a tiny ceremonial movement that bought him 2 seconds to decide whether to begin with accusation or information. And in the end, he chose neither, resting his forearms on the arms of the chair and asking, "How long were you planning to keep me blind?" And Claire did not flinch at the phrasing, which irritated him because part of him wanted visible guilt, wanted some external sign that the imbalance of the evening had cost her something immediate. But she only glanced down at the envelope he had brought, then back up at him, and said, "I stopped planning anything about 6 hours ago." And the answer was so unadorned that it briefly disarmed him, because it wasn't defensive, it wasn't clever, it was merely tired truth, and tired truth was harder to fight than polished evasion. "You knew about the amendment," he said. "You let me build a financing structure that could trigger it." "I helped keep the trigger from being noticed," Claire replied. "That's not the same as helping build it. It's adjacent enough. Everything in our lives is adjacent enough," she said, and that landed between them heavier than he expected, because it was both deflection and confession, and he saw in the set of her mouth that she knew it, knew she was no longer speaking only about paperwork, and for a moment neither said anything, while the office breathed around them in small mechanical sounds. The muted hum of air conditioning from the vent near the windows, a faint click from some system settling into nighttime mode, the distant elevator bell out in the hall where nobody stepped out. And Daniel found himself noticing the familiar objects on Claire's desk with unusual intensity. The brass pen she had stolen from his office years ago and never returned, the frame turned slightly inward, as if she had stopped looking at the photograph it held, the stack of binders tabbed in her exacting hand, and the sight of those ordinary continuities amid the rupture of the night made him strangely angrier, because it suggested the world had been able to continue functioning, while something essential between them had been quietly rearranged. Claire opened the envelope and removed the copied pages one by one, laying them flat with her fingertips. "Did she show you anything beyond this?" she asked. "Enough to tell me Ethan is sleeping with someone in one of our buildings." Claire's eyes closed for one beat, then opened again. "Of course he is," she said, and the absence of surprise in her voice contained years of practiced disappointment, not just in Ethan, but in the entire family system that kept producing versions of the same man in different suits, and Daniel almost asked whether she had known that too, but he stopped himself because the question no longer even felt dramatic. It felt procedural. "Did you?" he asked anyway. Claire leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "No. I suspected he was hiding something. Not that." Daniel studied her face for the small tells he used to trust, the tightening at the outer corners of her eyes when she omitted a detail, the subtle flattening of her mouth when she was about to redirect, but tonight they seemed less readable, or perhaps he was finally noticing how much interpretation he had always layered onto them. "And Reeves?" he asked. "What exactly were you managing?" Claire drew in a slow breath, then uncrossed her arms and reached for the glass of water, taking a sip not because she needed it, he thought, but because it forced a pause she could control. "He came to me 3 months ago after he heard from one of the regional lenders that our debt ratio on the riverfront package was more aggressive than the board had been told. He didn't know about the amendment, not specifically, but he knew there had to be some estate protection somewhere because your father never left anything unguarded. He wanted assurance that if he helped move zoning through, Mercer Development wouldn't implode halfway into Phase 1. Daniel's laugh this time was harsher. "So, you reassured him." "I bought time." "With what?" "With access." He stared at her. She held the stare, not defiant now but steady, as if she had crossed some internal threshold beyond which there was no point in shading the truth. "What kind of access?" he asked. "Draft projections. Legal opinions. Enough to make him feel informed without giving him enough to hang us." "Us," Daniel repeated. And Claire's expression shifted slightly, some flicker of pain or annoyance too small to categorize. "Yes, Daniel, us. Despite what tonight is trying to make everything look like, I spent most of the last 5 years protecting us from your impulses, your father's ghosts, Ethan's stupidity, and a board full of men who like profits as long as no one forces them to acknowledge how they're made." The sentence should have felt self-serving. Instead, it felt uncomfortably plausible, and that plausibility irritated him more than if she had lied outright, because he could feel his anger losing its clean edges, fraying into something harder to wield. He stood abruptly, crossed to the windows, and looked down at the city. From this height, the streets looked diagrammed, almost abstract, red and white lights sliding in measured streams between dark blocks. The distance flattened consequence. Buildings became shapes, people became movement, and for a second he understood why his father had liked offices high above the ground. They made it easier to believe human complications could be converted into manageable patterns. "Did you ever intend to tell me before it became leverage in someone else's hands?" he asked without turning around. Behind him there was a small rustle of paper. "Yes," Claire said. "I intended to tell you after the hearing, once the vote was done, and we knew whether the project could be restructured without collapsing your position." "My position. Do not do that," she said, and her voice sharpened. "Do not pretend there's a meaningful line between your position and your self-concept. You built your entire adult life on making sure nobody could separate the two." He turned then. "And you helped me do it." Claire gave a tired nod. "Yes." The simplicity of that answer stopped him. Not denial, not excuse, just yes. He walked back to the desk slowly, feeling the anger shift again, now complicated by memory, by the fact that he could not honestly pretend she had merely ridden beside him while he drove. Claire had negotiated the first city tax abatement that let Mercer Development move from regional nuisance to county power. Claire had found the vulnerabilities in competitor bids, had soothed lenders, had stood beside him at fundraisers and funerals and hostile board dinners. Always composed, always appearing a fraction less hungry than everyone else, while in private, understanding appetite as fluently as he did. They had built each other's competence. That was part of what made betrayal here feel so structurally devastating. It did not come from an outsider. It came from the only person who truly understood the architecture. "Why didn't you trust me with it?" he asked. And this time, the question was stripped of performance enough to surprise even him. Claire looked at him for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was quieter than it had been all night. "Because you were becoming him." Daniel said nothing. He felt the words arrive in his body before his mind fully accepted them. A tightening across the chest, not pain exactly, but the physical recognition of an accusation he had anticipated for years and still never learned how to absorb without reaction. "That's easy to say now," he replied at last. "It would have been easier not to say it at all," Claire said. "I've spent 2 years trying not to." He looked away first, toward the shelves behind her desk where litigation treatises sat beside, framed awards, and a pottery bowl from a vacation they had taken before everything in life became strategic. He remembered that trip with sudden useless clarity. Coastal Maine in late September, fog over the water, Claire in a heavy sweater laughing because he had taken a work call from the pier and nearly dropped his phone into the harbor. They had still believed then that work was what they did, not what it would eventually make them become. "You think I didn't see it?" Claire continued. "The way you started talking about Ethan, like he was an exposure event instead of your brother. The way every disagreement became disloyalty. The way you said contain instead of help when your mother called crying after the second estate hearing. I knew exactly where it was heading because I watched your father do the same thing until everyone around him became either an instrument or a problem." Daniel pulled out the chair again and sat, but this time the movement held less resistance. He was tired now in a deeper way than earlier, not physically, not even emotionally in the dramatic sense, but in the private, muscular sense of holding too many contradictions upright at once. "And what did you become while you were protecting me from that?" he asked. Claire let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh. "Efficient," she said, then resentful, then good at hiding the resentment. He looked at her sharply, because that was the first sentence all night that felt like a door opening onto a room neither of them usually entered. "Resentful of me? Of the role? Of what we kept calling necessary? Of how often I cleaned up the human aftermath while you called it noise?" Daniel started to object, then stopped because he could already hear the weakness of the denial. There had been noise. There had also been people inside it. He knew that. He had simply trained himself to weight one fact over the other. Claire reached for the legal pad and turned it toward herself, jotting something down with quick, precise strokes. "We don't have time to do all of this honestly tonight," she said, as if reading from a practical script she'd written in her head during the call. "So here's what matters immediately. If Lila sends that amendment to the board before we act, the Independents will demand an emergency review. If that happens while the recording is still cycling through the press, you lose narrative control and maybe the company. If you withdraw tonight on your own terms, we can frame it as a response to process concerns and financing recalibration." Daniel leaned back. "We." Claire met his eyes. "Yes, we. Unless you'd prefer to walk into tomorrow with righteous personal clarity and nothing left to salvage." He hated that she was right, hated more that she sounded like him when she said it. "And Ethan?" he asked. "What about him? If the video hits?" Claire's expression hardened into something almost impersonal. "Then his marriage probably detonates, and if it reaches the board before the vote issue is contained, he becomes either a liability or a martyr, depending on who tells the story first." Daniel rubbed his mouth, feeling the beginnings of a headache pulse behind his eyes. "I can't protect everyone." "No," Claire said. "You can't." The sentence was not cruel. That made it worse. He watched her for a moment, the lamplight catching the tired lines near her mouth, the place at her collar where one button had come undone, the ink smudge on the side of her hand from writing too quickly, and he was struck by the intimate unfamiliarity of her, the fact that he knew the geography of her face, and still had not understood the full content of her silence, for months, maybe longer. "Did you ever think about leaving?" he asked, the question surfacing before he could decide against it. Claire went still. The office seemed to do the same, even the hum in the ceiling receding in his awareness. She looked down at the legal pad, then at the window, and finally back at him. "Yes," she said, "not because of one thing, because of accumulation." Daniel absorbed that without visible response, but internally something shifted with a quiet finality. Not broke, not yet. Shifted, as if a truth he had kept safely, theoretical, had stepped into the room and taken a chair. "Why didn't you?" he asked. Claire's face changed, softened briefly into something more naked than either of them was accustomed to tolerating. "Because leaving you and stopping you were not the same thing," she said. "And for a long time I wasn't sure which one I wanted more." Daniel stared at her. There was no clean answer to that. No line sharp enough to cut with. He could be angry that she stayed for strategy. He could be grateful she stayed at all. He could recognize that both were true and still not know what to do with either. Claire turned the legal pad back toward him. She had written 3 bullet points in neat block letters. Withdrawal letter. Lender notice. Board call order. Under them, smaller. "Ethan? We draft the withdrawal now," she said. "You sign it. I send it to Reeves, the city clerk, and council. Then we alert the lender that we're pausing pending review. That buys hours. Maybe a day. After that, we decide whether the board hears about the amendment from us or from Lila." Daniel looked at the list. The clarity of it was almost offensive. These tidy steps applied to a night that had stripped half the illusion from his marriage and his company in the span of hours. Yet the clarity was also relieving in the most dangerous way, because it offered action, and action was the oldest anesthetic he knew. "And Ethan?" he asked again. Claire leaned back, eyes on him now, not the paper. "That depends," she said, "on whether tonight is the first time you're willing to sacrifice your brother's protection to preserve the structure, or the first time you're willing to risk the structure by telling the family the truth." Daniel held her gaze, hearing the question beneath the statement, the one she would not voice directly because once voiced, it would apply not only to Ethan, but to them, to everything, and he understood that the work in front of them was no longer just legal or political. It was moral in the least glamorous sense, a series of ugly triage choices with no innocence available at the end. He picked up the pen from her desk, rolled it once between his fingers, and looked down at the blank legal pad page she slid toward him, the paper bright under the lamp, waiting to become either a retreat or a disguise, and in the reflection of the dark window behind Claire, he saw them both faintly superimposed on the city. 2 figures bent over, the first formal surrender either had ever allowed themselves to name. Daniel lowered the pen to the page but did not write immediately, and the hesitation itself seemed to alter the air in the room, because Claire, who had watched him sign guarantees, litigation responses, acquisition terms, political pledges, and condolence notes with the same steady hand, now stood completely still, as if any movement might break whatever fragile honesty had made it this far into the night, and he stared at the paper while language presented itself in familiar corporate disguises: strategic pause, recalibration, stewardship, procedural integrity, and for the first time in years, Those phrases did not feel like tools so much as gauze, clean and expensive, and made for covering damage without addressing it, and he could hear his father in the back of his mind, saying that paper did not exist to reveal motive, only to control consequence. And the fact that the lesson still came to him in that voice made his grip tighten involuntarily around the pen. "If I write this the way we usually would," he said without looking up, "it becomes another performance," and Claire answered after a short pause. Yes. Not because she approved, but because she was too tired to lie about the nature of what they were doing, and he glanced at her then, at the tired precision in her face, the guardedness that had thinned into something rawer as the night progressed, and he asked, "What would you write if this were only truth?" Claire leaned one hip against the edge of the desk, folding her arms loosely. "Not something we could send," she said. "Try me." She looked down at the blank page for a moment, then spoke as if reading from words she had never planned to say aloud. "I would write that we pushed a project past the point where it could still pretend to be about civic improvement. I would write that the financing became unstable because the ambition behind it became unstable. I would write that public trust was damaged because private leverage replaced public process, and that stepping back now is less honorable than it is overdue." Daniel listened without interrupting, and each sentence struck him as both accusation and relief, the kind of relief that comes when someone else says the forbidden version first and proves the room will remain standing afterward, and he let the pen hover over the paper another second before finally writing, not her version, and not the old version either, but something narrower, cleaner, stripped of the usual self-congratulating varnish. In light of unresolved process concerns and newly surfaced conflicts that risk undermining the legitimacy of the proposed riverfront redevelopment vote, Mercer Development is withdrawing its present application effective immediately. He stopped, read it once, then continued, the pen moving more quickly now, as if momentum itself could keep him from thinking too hard about the meaning lodged inside the act. This decision is made to prevent further erosion of public confidence and to allow full review of the procedural and financial issues now in question. He signed it with a signature that looked, to his own eye, almost aggressive, and slid the page across the desk to Claire, who read it in silence, her finger once touching the phrase public confidence, as though testing the texture of it. And then she nodded. "It'll do," she said, which was the most approval either of them had offered anything all night. She moved immediately, scanning the letter, attaching it to an email, writing the subject line with the speed of muscle memory, and Daniel watched her from across the desk, with the unsettling sense that even now, even after everything, part of him was comforted by her competence, and that comfort felt dangerous because it threatened to blur what had been exposed between them, threatened to let capability pass again for intimacy. And he did not want that tonight. Did not want the old narcotic of efficiency to smooth the edges of what had finally been named. "Before you send it," he said. And Claire paused with her hand on the trackpad. "What?" "We decide about Ethan." Her mouth tightened. "There may not be a decision left if Lila's already cued the release." "Maybe not. But if there is, we decide now." Claire held his gaze for a long moment, then closed the laptop halfway without sending the message yet. "What exactly are you asking?" she said. "Whether we call him first, whether we tell him, whether we let him walk into tomorrow blind and absorb his own impact the way I'm absorbing mine." Claire took off her watch and set it beside the computer. Another tiny sign of fatigue, or perhaps honesty, because people removed armor in stages. "Do you want the ethical answer or the strategic answer?" "I'm not sure there's a difference left." "There is always a difference left," she said quietly. "That's what keeps making this harder." Daniel stood again, restless, and began to pace the length of the office, his steps slow on the carpet, one hand in his pocket, the other rubbing once at the back of his neck. He thought of Ethan at 16, coming home drunk and unafraid because charm had always functioned for him as an alibi. Ethan at 29, missing a due diligence deadline and somehow turning the reprimand into a story about Daniel's severity. Ethan at their father's funeral, eyes red not only from grief but from panic, because for all his resentment he had never expected to live in a world without a larger male force to orbit or resist. Daniel had spent years telling himself his brother was not his responsibility. That was only half true. In families like theirs, responsibility was rarely chosen. It simply moved toward the most functional person in the room and stayed there until that person collapsed or fled. "If the video reaches his wife without warning," Daniel said, "it destroys whatever chance remains of containing the fallout inside the family." Claire's expression shifted slightly at the phrase "inside the family," perhaps because containment was exactly the old language she'd accused him of, perhaps because despite herself she still shared enough of the instinct to understand the appeal. "And if we warn him," she asked, "then he runs, or lies, or deletes something useful, or calls the woman, or tries to get ahead of it in the stupidest way possible. Daniel stopped pacing and looked at her. You really think that little of him? Claire let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. No. I think exactly that much of his coping skills. That stung because it was accurate. Daniel turned toward the windows again. In the glass, he could see them both faintly. Claire behind the desk, himself in motion, the city beyond them like an electrical field. He thought of what Leela had said in the hotel lounge, that no one stopped unless stopping cost more than continuing, and he found himself wondering whether this exact unbearable crossroads, was what cost actually looked like when it finally arrived. Not a noble reckoning, not cinematic ruin, just a sequence of decisions in fluorescent light, each one saving one relationship by putting pressure on another. Call him, he said at last. Claire's eyebrows lifted slightly. You? He nodded once. Me. Why? He took a second to answer because any immediate answer would sound rehearsed even to him. Because if I'm going to let the structure fracture, he said, I need to stop choosing the structure first in every room. Claire said nothing for a moment. Then she reopened the laptop, hit send on the withdrawal email, and slid Ethan's contact card across the desk on her phone. Daniel ignored the phone and used his own. The call rang longer than he expected, and in those extra seconds Daniel became acutely aware of the room again. Claire's eyes on him, the cooling coffee in the mug near the lamp, the soft red light on the conference phone in the corner, the city outside continuing its indifferent midnight movement. And then Ethan answered with a voice thick from sleep, or alcohol, or both. Dan? There was confusion first, then instant wariness, because middle-of-the-night calls between brothers like them rarely delivered anything gentle. Where are you? Daniel asked. At home. A lie, maybe, or maybe not. Ethan's voice carried the muffled hollow of a large room. Not enough background sound to tell. Alone? What is this? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. There were easier ways to do it, more tactical ways. He could triangulate, imply, soften. Instead, he heard himself say, Someone has video of you with a woman from the Ashford Tower condo. Silence. Then, what? It was a stupid word, but shock often used stupid words first. Daniel waited. Claire did not move. Ethan, he said, listen carefully. This is not a rumor. It's leverage. It may go public tomorrow. Ethan's breathing changed, not dramatically, just enough for Daniel to hear the body reacting before the mind found shape. Who has it? He asked. That part doesn't matter right now. It matters to me. Welcome to the evening. Ethan cursed under his breath, a raw, unpracticed sound. Is Claire there? He asked next, and the question made Daniel glance at her. She looked away, toward the documents on the desk, giving him the privacy of not watching his face while still hearing every word. Yes, Daniel said. Did she know? Ethan asked. Daniel almost laughed at the universality of the question. How quickly everyone in this family defaulted to inventorying who knew what and when, as if betrayal were less painful when properly catalogued. No, he said. And then because tonight had already broken the seal on too many omissions to keep indulging old habits, he added, not about that. Ethan was silent again. Daniel pictured him now more clearly, sitting up somewhere in the dark, one hand through his hair, mouth half open, the first ugly geometry of consequence arranging itself around him. What do you want me to do? Ethan asked finally, and the vulnerability in it was so unfamiliar, Daniel almost mistook it for manipulation, before recognizing something more basic underneath fear. Yes, but also the old reflex of younger siblings who have never fully stopped assuming the older one sees the map before they do. I want you not to run, Daniel said. I want you not to call her, not to text, not to delete anything, not to invent a story before morning, and I want you at the office at 7. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. That bad? Daniel looked at Claire. She was watching him now, expression unreadable, fingers resting lightly on the closed folder nearest her. Yes, he said. That bad. Ethan said nothing for several seconds. Then, quieter. Does Nora know? Nora, his wife. Daniel felt the question land and understood that for Ethan, beneath all the panic, this was the true center of terror. Not the board or the company, or even public humiliation, but Nora's face when she learned that his carelessness had crossed from suspicion into proof. Not yet, Daniel said. Then tell me whether I tell her tonight or wait. Daniel looked out at the city again, at the grid of lights, at how calm everything appeared from enough distance. and he heard Claire's words from earlier ethical answer or strategic answer, and realized the entire family had been living inside that split for so long they no longer recognized it as a split. He thought of Nora at holidays. Too smart to be fooled, too self-respecting to beg for scraps of honesty, the kind of woman who had likely already learned to distinguish between absence and deceit, but not yet been forced to say it aloud. "You tell her tonight," Daniel said, surprising himself less than he might have an hour earlier. Ethan inhaled sharply. "Jesus, Dan." "Tonight," Daniel repeated, "before anyone else does, and then you come in at 7. You think that saves me?" "No," Daniel said. "I think it stops you from making it filthier." The line was quiet. At last Ethan said, "Okay." No argument, no charm, just a small, devastated surrender. And Daniel felt something inside him tighten and release at once, a grim acknowledgement that he had just chosen family truth over immediate containment, and would probably pay for it in ways not yet visible. 7, he said, and ended the call before either of them could reach for softer words they did not know how to use. He lowered the phone slowly, then placed it on the desk. Claire's eyes remained on him. "Well?" he asked. "You sounded like your father for the first half," she said. Then, after a beat, "and not at all like him for the second." Daniel absorbed that without answering. There was no compliment in it, only observation, and yet he felt it more than he wanted to. Claire reopened the lender file and began drafting the pause notice, speaking as she typed. "The withdrawal is out," Reeves replied already. "What did he say?" "Nothing substantive, just that he regrets the circumstances and looks forward to a productive path forward." Daniel gave a humorless smile. "Coward." "Practical coward," Claire corrected. "Those survive longer." She finished the lender notice, sent it, and then swiveled the laptop toward him. "Board call order," she said. "If we're going to disclose before Lila does, we do it at dawn, not before. Too early, and it looks panicked. Too late, and she beats us." Daniel scanned the list of names. Independent directors first, then general counsel, then 2 institutional stakeholders. No wasted motion, no sentimental sequencing. "You've already decided," he said. Claire met his eyes. "I made a recommendation. You still have veto power, unless tonight has made that concept feel less clean to you." He almost said something sharp in return, but stopped. The truth was that veto power did feel less clean now, not because he had suddenly become virtuous, but because the costs of singular control had finally become visible in human scale. "No veto," he said. "We call them in your order." Claire nodded, made a note, then finally sat down in the chair behind the desk for the first time since he arrived. The shift in posture changed her. She looked smaller, not weaker, simply no longer held upright by crisis alone. "Daniel," she said. He looked up. "If we get through tomorrow," she said, "the board may still keep you in place temporarily, or they may split authority under the amendment and call it stabilization. Either way, you need to understand something before morning." He waited. Claire folded her hands once, then unfolded them. "I will not spend the next year helping you recreate the same system with cleaner language." The words were calm, but they landed with the unmistakable force of ultimatum. Daniel sat very still. "Are you talking about the company?" he asked. "Or us?" Claire's face did not change much, but the pause before she answered was answer enough even before the words came. "I don't know that I get to separate them anymore," she said. Outside, somewhere down in the street canyon below, a siren passed and faded without ever coming near them. Just another city sound moving along its own line, and Daniel found that he could not immediately respond. Not because he lacked words, but because too many of them were suddenly inadequate. Apology sounded theatrical. Defense sounded tired. Promise sounded fraudulent. What remained was thinner and more difficult. "Then don't," he said quietly. Claire looked at him with something like surprise, then caution, as if she had expected resistance and found instead an opening she was not sure she trusted. Daniel glanced at the papers on the desk, the sent emails, the call list, the legal language that would carry them into morning, and felt with bleak clarity that none of it solved anything fundamental. The project was paused. The vote was dead. Ethan was walking into his own confession. The board would know by sunrise. Leela would still decide what to release and when. The company might survive by redistributing power. His marriage might survive only by ceasing to function in the form it had taken for years. Saving one thing had already begun fracturing another. He reached for the now cold coffee, took a sip anyway, grimaced at the bitterness, and set it down. "Do we tell my mother before the board?" he asked. And Claire closed her eyes for a brief second, perhaps out of fatigue, perhaps out of pity for the fact that no decision tree tonight spared anyone who mattered. "Yes," she said, At 6:30, after Ethan, before the directors. Daniel nodded slowly. Another fracture scheduled. Another room where truth would arrive too late to feel generous. Claire picked up the phone to set an alarm, then stopped, looking at the time. It's after 1, she said. If we leave now, you have maybe 4 hours before this starts again. Daniel glanced toward the dark window where their faint reflections hovered over the city like ghosts pinned to glass. I'm not sleeping, he said. Neither am I. Claire stood, gathered the folders into separate stacks, and handed him one marked board materials. Their fingers touched briefly in the transfer. A familiar contact emptied of ease and yet not of meaning, and for a moment both of them seemed aware of how much history could live inside something as small as that accidental brush of skin. Come home, she said then. And the phrase should have sounded simple, but in the wake of everything it carried too many meanings at once. A logistical suggestion, a truce, a request not to leave the field entirely before dawn, and Daniel looked at her, at the exhaustion she was no longer hiding, at the discipline still holding her upright, and understood that going home would not restore anything. It would simply move the reckoning into rooms filled with shared objects and older silences. Even so, he nodded, because there was nowhere else tonight that would not feel like exile. And together, without another word for several seconds, they turned off the desk lamp, leaving the office to the blue-gray wash of city light and the glow of computer sleep modes, and stepped out into the corridor side by side, carrying between them, not resolution, but the first documented evidence that the system they had built was finally beginning to answer for itself. The elevator ride down to the garage took less than a minute, but inside that sealed vertical drift, the silence between them changed shape several times. First practical, then strained, then almost companionable in the exhausted way that follows shared labor rather than shared comfort, and Daniel watched the floor numbers light and fade above the door, while Claire stood beside him with the board materials tucked under one arm, her other hand loosely wrapped around her phone, no rings of conversation coming through now, no emergencies interrupting the strange stillness they had earned only by stepping deeper into disaster. And when the doors opened onto the concrete chill of the underground level, the air smelled faintly of oil, dust, and damp cement, a smell stripped of performance, unlike hotel lobbies and executive floors and council chambers, and something about that blunt physicality steadied him as they walked toward their cars. Claire stopped when they reached the dividing line between his sedan and her SUV, and looked at him with that same distilling tiredness he had seen in the office, the expression of someone who had been practical for so long that emotion now arrived only after being filtered through usefulness. And she said, "Take my car," as if logistics were the only matter left to settle. And Daniel frowned. Why? Because if reporters are already outside the house, yours is recognizable from half a block away. He let out a short breath, something like a laugh, and not at all like one. You think they're there already? Claire held his gaze. I think by tonight we stopped earning the luxury of surprise. That was true enough that he did not argue, and they shifted folders and keys in silence, the micro-ritual of exchanging vehicles feeling more intimate than it should have. More intimate, perhaps, than the conversation upstairs, because it was built from an old marital muscle memory that had not yet decided whether it was dead or merely wounded. And when Claire handed him the SUV keys, their fingers touched again, briefly, and this time, neither ignored it, neither dramatized it either, but the fact of contact lingered just long enough to remind him that the body often remained loyal to habit after the mind had begun revising its allegiances. They drove separately out of the garage and into the city's thin late-night traffic. Claire behind him, now in the sedan, headlights catching and receding in his mirror as they moved through a network of mostly empty streets where red lights seemed longer than usual and crosswalks lay vacant under sodium lamps, and Daniel found his mind dividing itself between the road and the house ahead, not the physical structure alone, but the rooms inside it. The hallway table with unopened mail, the kitchen where they had eaten standing up more often than seated in recent years, the study where he had made too many calls that shaped other people's lives, the bedroom, where even sleep had become a negotiation of territory and fatigue, and he wondered whether going there tonight would reveal anything, or merely place old furniture around new truths, which might be worse. By the time they turned into the neighborhood, the silence of wealth had settled over everything. Trimmed hedges, dark windows, long drives, the studied order of people who spent money to make their lives appear untroubled. And Daniel saw immediately that Claire had been right. A car sat half a house down with two figures inside and the vague glow of phone screens on their faces. Another vehicle idled near the corner. Not a siege, not yet, but enough to confirm the perimeter had been marked. Claire flashed her headlights once from behind him, a signal to keep moving, and Daniel did. turning not into the main drive but toward the side entrance through the rear gate, one of the many conveniences they had once treated as normal, and now suddenly recognized for what it was: design for discretion. They parked near the back, and the night around the house held the cold, suspended quiet that comes before dawn, but after certainty, when every sound becomes distinct. A sprinkler clicked somewhere on a neighboring property. Tree branches scraped faintly against brick. Claire locked the SUV the second she stepped out, then stood very still for a moment, with her face turned toward the yard, as if listening for movement. Not intruders, exactly, more the shape of the place itself, and Daniel watched her profile in the dim security light, the tired line of her shoulders, the set of her mouth, and thought with sudden, painful clarity that if someone had asked him yesterday whether he knew his wife, he would have answered yes with insulted confidence, and yet tonight he was looking at her like a man, reading an old language he had once spoken fluently and could still understand only in fragments. Inside, the house was dark except for the kitchen sconces. Claire turned on without being asked, their warm, low light spreading over marble counters, and the long island where unopened invitations and 2 pieces of ordinary mail sat in a neat pile, evidence that the machinery of respectable life had continued issuing its little bureaucratic demands, even while everything else split open. And Claire set the folders on the counter, loosened her hair at the nape of her neck, and said, "Tea or whiskey?" without irony. Daniel took off his coat and draped it over a stool. "Water." She nodded once, filled 2 glasses anyway, and slid one toward him before taking the other for herself, though she only held it for several moments without drinking. The kitchen had always been the room where they told themselves they were most normal, discussing schedules, checking in between meetings, pretending to host friends more often than they actually did, and now that pretense felt almost tender in retrospect, the cheap decency of people trying to behave like a married couple, while also functioning as a private firm with shared assets and different methods of concealment. Daniel leaned both hands on the island and looked at her. "Did you mean it?" he asked. Claire, who had just raised the glass, stopped halfway. "Which part? That you thought about leaving?" She lowered the glass again, setting it down carefully, and in the quiet clink against the stone, he heard both fatigue and choice. "Yes," she said. No embellishment, no attempt to manage his reaction, just yes. Daniel nodded once, more to keep his face still than because he knew what else to do with the answer. "When?" he asked. Claire let her fingertips rest against the base of the glass. "The first time? After your mother's birthday dinner last spring." He frowned. Of all nights, that one had not seemed memorable to him. Too much wine, Ethan late, his mother sentimental, an argument about whether to sell the lake property. Because of what? Because you spent 45 minutes publicly humiliating Ethan over a numbers error that could have waited until morning, she said. Because your mother cried in the powder room, and then came out apologizing for making things harder for you, and you didn't even notice she was apologizing. Because on the drive home you told me that sometimes family only responds to pressure, and when I asked whether pressure was all you recognized anymore, you said, "When it works, yes." Daniel remembered the words as soon as she said them. Not the emotion attached to them then, because at the time they had felt merely efficient, but the words themselves, dry and certain, tossed off while looking at traffic. He had not known she was storing them. "And the second time?" he asked. Claire gave him a tired half-smile with no softness in it. "You're assuming there were only 2. He looked away. She was right, of course. Accumulation, she had called it. And accumulation never belonged to isolated events. It belonged to pattern. He took a drink of water at last. It tasted metallic from the pipes, colder than expected. "Why didn't you?" he asked again. Because the practical reasons she had given earlier did not entirely satisfy the deeper question. Claire moved around the island and pulled out a chair, sitting with one leg crossed under the other, her posture no longer executive now, simply worn. "Because every time I got close," she said, "something happened that made leaving feel less like self-preservation and more like abandonment. Your father died. Then the board instability. Then your mother's health scare, minor as it was. Then Ethan's divorce rumors the first time. Then the financing fights. And under all of it, there was the part I hated admitting to myself, which was that I still loved some version of you, even while I liked the current version less and less." The sentence entered the room with none of the romance the word loved usually carried. It sounded instead like a document filed under difficult truths, binding and inconvenient. Daniel stood motionless, absorbing the distinction she had made, some version of you, and knew she had chosen the phrasing carefully, not because she was uncertain, but because she was exact. "Which version?" he asked, his voice lower now without intending it. Claire looked past him briefly, toward the dark window above the sink where their reflections floated faintly against the glass. The one who used to recognize that winning and deserving were not the same thing, she said. The one who could still be ashamed without turning shame into retaliation. The one who laughed more than once a month. The one who knew power was a tool and not a diet. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. And with it came an old memory so vivid it almost seemed staged by the house itself. The two of them years ago in a cramped apartment, before Mercer Development had become what it was, eating takeout lo mein from cartons on the floor because the table had not been delivered yet. Claire, barefoot, hair pinned up with a pencil, both of them mocking one of his father's speeches until they were laughing too hard to continue, and the memory hurt not because it suggested innocence they had never been innocent, but because it revealed how far sophistication had drifted into corrosion. I don't know if that version exists anymore, he said. Claire nodded slowly. I know. No comfort. Again, that was what made it honest. Somewhere upstairs, the house creaked as pipes adjusted or wood settled. Daniel glanced toward the back hall, toward the staircase invisible from where he stood, and the vertical arrangement of the house suddenly seemed symbolic in a way he would normally despise. Floors of private life stacked over this bright, practical room where truth kept arriving wearing administrative clothes. If tomorrow goes badly, he said, they may move to split authority immediately. They probably will, Claire said. Even if they keep you in title, they'll want operating guardrails. And if they don't, then they're cowards. Daniel almost smiled. That's a broad category these days. Yes. She drank at last, then set the empty glass aside with a finality that suggested she had forgotten how thirsty she was until the first swallow. The harder question, she said, is what you do if they let you stay with conditions. Daniel understood instantly what she meant, because the night had made every previous abstraction personal. If power remained available, would he treat the lessons of this collapse as temporary inconvenience or structural indictment? He rested a hand flat against the cool stone countertop and answered with unusual care. I don't know yet. Claire seemed to consider whether that was cowardice or progress, then gave a small nod as if deciding uncertainty was, for now, preferable to false clarity. That may be the most useful answer you've given me in months, she said. The compliment, if it was one, made him ache in a place he was not prepared to inspect. On the counter, Claire's phone lit up and buzzed once. Both of them looked at it automatically. A message preview. Karen. Local blog picked up withdrawal. No amendment yet. Daniel felt the line of the night extend into morning. It started, he said. Claire glanced at the clock on the microwave. It never stopped. She replied to Karen with fast economical movements, then set the phone face down. 4 hours, she said. Maybe less. Daniel checked his own phone. No new messages from Lila, none from Ethan either, which unsettled him more than panic would have. Silence after warning meant action, collapse, or paralysis. He thought of Ethan having to wake Nora, having to choose words, maybe failing to choose them at all. He thought of his mother asleep alone in the old house across town, still believing that blood and property could be managed with the same rituals forever. He thought of the board members whose early morning civility would conceal appetites sharpened by scandal. And beneath all of it, persistent as a background frequency, he thought of Claire's distinction, some version of you. Come upstairs, Claire said. The words were quiet, practical at first hearing, but nothing tonight was only one thing. Daniel looked at her carefully. To sleep? He asked. Claire's mouth almost curved, not in humor but in recognition of the absurdity. To lie down, she said. To be horizontal for an hour. To stop standing in kitchens like people waiting for a verdict. He followed her up the stairs, and the house around them held that peculiar nighttime intimacy, in which familiar objects become slightly foreign. Hallway art dimmed to shape and shadow, the runner soft underfoot, the banister cold when Daniel's hand brushed it, and by the time they reached the bedroom, he realized how long it had been since he had entered it without either exhaustion or agenda. Claire went first into the ensuite, washed off her makeup in efficient practiced motions, changed into a plain t-shirt and cotton pants, and when she came back into the room, Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed, with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled, staring at nothing visible. She crossed to her side, turned down the lamp, then paused. You should shower, she said. You smell like stale coffee and hotel air. He looked up at her. And for one suspended second, the comment carried the almost lost texture of ordinary marriage, the microscopic intimacy of noticing bodies without symbolism. And he nodded, got up, went into the bathroom, and let hot water beat against the back of his neck until the mirror fogged and his skin flushed, and still none of it seemed enough to wash off the night, because what clung now was not residue but recognition. When he came back out, Claire was already under the covers on her side, turned partly away but not fully, one lamp still on. He got into bed beside her, leaving a careful margin between them by instinct. The mattress shifted. The room smelled faintly of clean linen and the cedar sachets Claire insisted on putting in drawers. Outside, somewhere beyond the closed curtains, a car door shut softly on the street. Reporters or neighbors, he could not tell. "Daniel," Claire said into the dimness. "What?" "Tomorrow will tempt you to perform remorse." He lay still, eyes on the ceiling. "I know. Don't." Her voice was nearly lost in the room. "If you can't be honest, at least be plain." He turned his head toward her. Her face was mostly in shadow now, but he could make out the line of her cheek, the loosened hair spread over the pillow, the shape of fatigue that had replaced makeup and composure. "And you?" he asked. "What will tomorrow tempt you to do?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, to mistake competence for forgiveness. He closed his eyes. That, too, was plain. Minutes passed, perhaps longer. The body's exhaustion began finally to make small claims on his thoughts, blurring the sharp edges without dulling them entirely. And just before sleep took or pretended to take him, he felt Claire's hand move across the sheet until her fingers rested lightly, almost formally, against the back of his wrist. Not clasping, not reconciliation, just contact, measured and insufficient and real. He did not move his hand away. He did not turn toward her either. They lay there in the dark like that, two people linked by the smallest available gesture, while outside the first birds had not yet begun, and the city had not yet decided what story it would tell about them in daylight. And when Daniel finally drifted into a shallow, fractured sleep, it was with the strange understanding that dawn would not bring clarity so much as distribution. The truths of the night, parceling themselves out across boardrooms, breakfast tables, inboxes, and front-page speculation, and that by evening the life he had spent years reinforcing might still be standing in outline while the internal walls had already been permanently moved, leaving everyone inside it to relearn the shape of the rooms. Daniel woke before the alarm to the pale, uncertain light that comes just before sunrise, when the edges of furniture emerge first, and the rest of the room follows reluctantly, and for one disoriented second, he did not remember why his body felt as if it had been assembled from bad joints and shallow breath, why the air in the room carried that charged stillness of a house holding too many unspoken things. And then memory returned not in sequence, but in hard fragments. The recording. Lila in the hotel lounge. The trust amendment. Ethan's broken silence on the phone. Claire saying some version of you. And he lay still beside her with his eyes open, staring at the faint seam in the curtains where morning had started pressing through. While Claire's hand was no longer on his wrist but rested, curled near her own chest, the distance between them restored sometime during the night, without either of them waking enough to notice. And he turned his head slightly to look at her profile in the dimness, at the loosened face of sleep that made her look younger and more defenseless than she ever allowed herself to appear in daylight. And the sight did not soften him exactly, but it rearranged his anger into something more adult, and therefore harder to carry, because fury required cleaner lines than the morning was willing to provide. The alarm sounded a minute later, quiet but insistent, and Claire reached for it instantly, silencing it with the practiced accuracy of someone who had trained herself to wake before any crisis could fully wake her. And when she turned onto her back and looked at the ceiling for a second before speaking, he could tell from that single pause that she had also remembered everything at once. "What time is it?" he asked, though the red digits were visible on her side of the room. 5:51, she said, her voice still thick with sleep but already gathering control. And then they both got up without another word, the choreography of necessity taking over where comfort could not. The bathroom filled with the small, intimate sounds of parallel readiness, faucet running, electric toothbrush humming, cabinet doors opening and closing, and Daniel found that he could barely tolerate his own reflection while shaving, not from shame in any theatrical sense, but from the more exhausting realization that his face remained largely competent-looking despite the night, which meant he would have to decide all over again what truth he intended to let show, and what he would still conceal out of habit. And Claire, standing at the adjacent sink, fastening earrings with one hand, while scanning overnight emails with the other, said, "Karen sent a summary at 5:30, and he wiped the razor, rinsed it, and asked, 'How bad?'" Claire scrolled. The withdrawals everywhere local. 2 regional business outlets picked it up. They're framing it as fallout from the recording and governance concerns. No board leak yet. Lila hasn't moved the amendment. At least not publicly. Daniel dried his face, then stood looking at the towel in his hand, as if it might offer further instruction. "Ethan?" he asked. Claire's eyes moved once more across the screen before she answered. "Text at 4:17. He told Nora. She asked him to leave. He's at the office already. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not because the outcome surprised him, but because the speed of it made the fracture feel colder, more administrative. Exactly the thing he had warned Ethan against and delivered anyway. Tell her tonight. He had said it with the righteousness of someone mistaking timing for virtue, and perhaps it had still been the least filthy option. Yet least filthy was a low moral rung to be standing on at dawn. Claire slipped the phone into her blazer pocket. Your mother next, she said, and Daniel nodded, though the thought of that call produced a different kind of dread than anything involving the board. Business people responded to exposure with calculation. His mother responded to it with memory, grievance, and bewildered loyalty, all of which were harder to manage because they arrived without clean incentives. They went downstairs dressed for war in the restrained costume of people who would not name it that. Claire in charcoal with her hair smooth and pinned, Daniel in navy and white, tie darker than usual, both of them carrying coffee they did not really want, and folders they could not afford to forget. And the kitchen looked offensively normal in the morning light. Fruit bowl, newspapers on the counter, sunlight catching the chrome faucet, the domestic set still dressed for a life that had already become inaccurate. Claire placed her phone on speaker and handed it to Daniel after dialing his mother. It rang 6 times before she answered, and when she did, her voice held the fragile breathiness of a woman who had not yet turned on enough lights to feel armored. Daniel? She said. Is everything all right? And the question nearly undid him, because it was such a parental sentence, such an obsolete offering, as if there were still versions of adulthood where her asking could meaningfully improve the answer. No, he said, choosing plainness because Claire had asked for it, and because embellishment would sound obscene here. I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere. A pause. Then the sound of sheets moving, a lamp click, her breathing sharpening. What happened? He told her in pieces. Not every moral detail, not the full architecture of corruption and omission, but enough. The public recording, the withdrawal from the vote, the likely board review, the trust amendment that might now surface, the fact that Ethan's marriage was also in crisis. He did not tell her about Lila's motives or Claire's silence or the hotel meeting, because the call could not carry that much truth without collapsing under it, and as he spoke he heard his mother make tiny, involuntary sounds of pain. Not words at first, just little audible reactions each time. The family part of the damage widened, and when he finished, there was a silence. So long he wondered if the line had failed before she finally said, Your father knew this would happen. And Daniel felt something inside him go cold in a familiar old place. What do you mean? He asked. Not this exactly, she said quickly, voice trembling now but steadier in the way people often become steadier once they find a script they've been living beside for years. But this kind of thing. The way power kept eating the house from the inside. The way nobody ever spoke plainly until it was too late. The amendment he told me there, might come a day when you'd hate him for trying to keep the company from becoming a weapon in one pair of hands. Daniel stared at the kitchen window, at the neat backyard beyond it, and said nothing. Claire was watching him from across the island, face still, coffee untouched. Did you know what was in it? He asked. Not the exact language, his mother said. He never showed me final documents, but I knew he was afraid of what happened when the business and the family stopped being distinguishable. Daniel nearly said they had stopped being distinguishable because his father made sure of it. Because he raised sons like heirs and rivals at once. Because he taught them to equate love with position and disappointment with moral defect. But none of those arguments mattered now, not on a call like this. And before he could shape any response, his mother asked, very quietly, Are you in danger of losing everything? The question hung there between melodrama and accounting, and Daniel answered with the only honesty he could defend. Not everything, but enough. His mother breathed in shakily. Then don't protect the company first, she said. It never protects you back. Claire looked at him sharply when she heard that, perhaps because it echoed too closely what the night had already been forcing him to confront. Daniel swallowed. We'll come by tonight, he said. Not if you're coming to explain numbers, she replied. Only if you're coming as my son. Then she hung up before he could answer. And Daniel stood in the bright kitchen holding the dead phone, feeling as though someone had reached into the oldest closed room in the house and opened a window without permission. Claire took the phone gently from his hand and set it aside. You all right? She asked. The question was absurd and kind and impossible. No, he said. Good, she answered after a beat, and there was no cruelty in it, only recognition that numbness would have been easier and more dangerous. By 6:43, they were in the car heading downtown together, Claire driving because she trusted herself behind the wheel more than him when his mind was elsewhere, and the city had fully awakened now, commuters at lights, delivery trucks at curbs, dog walkers passing coffee shops. the machinery of ordinary Tuesday life, refusing to slow for private catastrophe. And Daniel watched storefronts slide by while Claire called the first independent director and gave the summary in clean, unemotional language. Withdrawal sent, governance concerns credible, trust amendment exists, emergency board session recommended before markets opened. The director, an old manufacturing executive named Halpern, who believed in discipline more than loyalty, asked only 2 questions. Was the amendment authentic, and did Daniel intend to contest it? Claire answered the first with yes, and the second with, he intends to cooperate with an immediate review. Daniel turned toward the window at that, not because it was false, but because hearing his own intentions stated in third-person corporate phrasing made him feel already partially dispossessed. The second director took the news with brittle silence, and then asked whether Ethan knew. The third asked whether there would be criminal exposure. General counsel wanted copies before 7:30. Each call shaved another layer off the structure, until by the time they pulled into the office garage, Daniel felt less like a chief executive arriving at a crisis than like a witness walking toward a statement he could no longer edit. Ethan was in the conference room when they entered, wearing yesterday's shirt under an ill-fitting jacket, his face gray with sleeplessness and shock, the handsome ease that had served him all his life gone so completely that for a moment he looked not younger than Daniel, as he usually did, but unfinished. He stood when they came in, then sat again immediately, as if his knees had misjudged the distance to composure. A paper cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. His phone lay screened down by his hand, a rare sign that he no longer trusted what it might contain. Nora threw a glass at the wall, he said, before either of them spoke, and the sentence came out in the tone of a man still stunned that actions had produced consequences with physics. Daniel set his folder on the table. Claire closed the door. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Ethan gave a humorless little smile. "Only in the ways that don't show." Daniel sat across from him. "Good," he said, not because he meant good in any generous sense, but because he could not bear to offer comfort before truth. Ethan flinched anyway. "Lila has the video?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "Or someone she's working with does." Ethan pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes for a second, then dropped them. "Was this about the condo?" Daniel looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, and the old instinct to lie flickered across his face before exhaustion beat it down. "She started there because it was discreet," he said. "The woman, Julia. She said it felt anonymous. I told her the building was held through a subsidiary, and nobody tracked it closely." Claire's expression did not change, which was more damning than outrage. "You used a company asset for an affair," she said. Ethan let out a small breath. "When you say it like that, it sounds terrible." Daniel stared at him. "What exact phrasing were you hoping for?" Ethan looked away first. The conference room glass reflected a faint city skyline behind them, while the overhead lights were too bright for the hour, exposing the tiredness under everyone's eyes. "I told Nora everything," Ethan said. "Or almost everything." "Meaning?" Daniel asked. Ethan swallowed. "I didn't mention the company tie. Just the affair." Claire leaned one palm flat on the table. "Then you call her again before 8, and correct that." Ethan looked at her as if she had slapped him. "Why?" "Because if the video drops with the building connection attached," Claire said, "she finds out twice, and the second lie becomes the one she remembers." Ethan stared at the table. "She already said she's calling a lawyer." Daniel felt an odd, sharp pity then. Not soft enough to absolve anything, but human enough to sting. Ethan had spent years treating marriage like a room he could leave emotionally without technically exiting, and now he was discovering that legal consequence could arrive faster than self-understanding. "Call her anyway," Daniel said. "After the board session," Ethan muttered. "Before," Claire said. "There is no later version of honesty that improves by delay." Ethan looked between them, perhaps noticing for the first time that on this morning they were aligned not in method, but in some harsher post-method clarity. He nodded once, miserable and compliant. Karen entered then without knocking, holding a tablet and 2 printouts, and the interruption saved everyone from having to sit any longer inside family wreckage without the anesthesia of procedure. "Press summary and board packet updates," she said, placing the documents in front of Claire and Daniel. "And one more thing." She hesitated, which was unlike her. "Lila Grant is downstairs." The room went still, not dramatically, not with theatrical shock, but with the concentrated stillness of people hearing a next move they had expected in theory and not yet prepared for in body. Daniel felt his spine straighten. "Why?" he asked. Karen glanced at the tablet. "She requested 10 minutes before the board convenes. Says she has material relevant to governance review and would prefer not to transmit it electronically if a direct handoff can be arranged." Claire's eyes flicked to Daniel, then to Ethan, then back to Karen. Who knows she's here? Lobby security, me, and now you. Daniel stood. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. He should have felt anger first. Instead, he felt something like inevitability. Of course she had come in person. Of course she wanted the transition from private leverage to institutional evidence to be embodied, witnessed, undeniable. I'll see her, he said. Claire rose too. No. She asked for direct handoff. That doesn't mean alone. Daniel almost argued, then stopped because the old reflex towards singular control felt suddenly cheap, juvenile even. Fine, he said. You come. Ethan pushed his chair back halfway. What about me? Daniel looked at him, at the ashen face, the shaking hand by the coffee cup, the brother he had spent years either disciplining or dismissing, and saw with bleak clarity that Ethan's relevance to the morning was both central and strangely reduced. Another man caught in a system designed by older men and maintained by his own weakness. You stay here, Daniel said, and you call Nora now. Ethan's mouth tightened. You don't get to talk to me like a child. Daniel held his gaze. Then stop behaving like one. The words landed hard, and for a second Ethan looked ready to explode, but whatever fire rose in him guttered almost instantly under the weight of the night and the visible fact that he no longer had a moral height from which to throw anything. He looked down, picked up his phone with a hand that was not steady, and said nothing. Claire and Daniel left together, walking down the corridor toward the elevator while office staff began arriving in careful clusters, faces professionally blank, eyes too alert, everyone already aware that something irreversible was in motion, and determined not to be the first one seen reacting to it. And as the elevator doors closed, Claire said, "Whatever she gives us, don't perform resistance unless you mean it." And Daniel nodded once. I know. The lobby was brighter than he wanted it to be, all glass and polished stone and the morning public moving through it with badges and coffees and ordinary purpose, and Lila stood near the security desk in a dark coat, holding a thin leather portfolio against her side, composed as ever, except that up close Daniel could see the fatigue under her eyes too, the cost of resolve written in details she did not intend to advertise. When she saw them approach, she gave a slight nod, not unlike the one from the hotel, but without any private edge this time. The setting had changed. This was no longer leverage between adversaries. It was evidence entering structure. You withdrew, she said. Daniel stopped an arm's length away. I did. Lila looked at Claire, then back at him. Good. She handed the portfolio not to Daniel but to Claire. Claire took it without comment and opened it just enough to scan the top page. Board routing memo. Copy of the amendment. Affidavit draft. A written summary of timeline and pressure points. More complete than Daniel had hoped. Less chaotic than he feared. There's one condition, Lila said. Daniel's jaw tightened. You already got what you wanted. Not all of it. Her voice remained calm, but there was strain underneath now. Not weakness. Just the wear of having to say the final thing plainly. The Hollis Code action gets withdrawn today. In writing. Before noon. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. No bluster. No bargaining theater. Just the request, or demand, or line she had drawn after all the rest. He thought of the auto shop family she had named in the hotel. People he had not remembered singularly until forced to, and understood that this, more than the board or the press, was the moral center she had been steering toward from the start. Claire closed the portfolio. It happens, she said, before Daniel could speak. And Daniel turned to her, hearing in the speed of her answer both agreement and a challenge. Are you going to object to the one plainly decent action left on the table? He did not. By noon, he said to Lila. She studied him, perhaps searching for irony, perhaps simply verifying that plainness had finally reached him in a usable form. Then she nodded once. Then I'm done sequencing, she said. Whatever follows, follows. It was not absolution. It was not alliance. But it was the closest thing to release anyone had offered him since the audio first played. Lila stepped back, turned, and walked toward the revolving doors, disappearing into the wash of morning light beyond the lobby glass, and Daniel watched her go with the strange sensation of having just witnessed the end of one kind of power and the beginning of another, less theatrical one, consequence stripped of performance. Beside him, Claire adjusted the portfolio under her arm and said, The board's in 18 minutes, and Daniel looked at the bright doors, at the city starting another ordinary day beyond them, and then back toward the elevators that would take them up to whatever the morning intended to remove, leaving behind not clarity, not redemption, but the first durable shape of accountability he had ever been forced to meet without intermediaries.